Thank you for joining us. I know you have to rush off and leave us. Tom Switzer has joined us from the US Studies Centre. Tom, I want to look at foreign policy here. Obama saying that the shadow of crisis has left the United States, that they're out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The worst of the global financial crisis has now washed through the system as well. But when you have an aggressive, if not belligerent Russia, when you have the ongoing threat of Islamic State, the threat of cyber attack as well, is he a bit premature in saying that the crises have really left the US?
Well, ever since Barack Obama became president in 2009, he has gone out of his way to redefine the American role in the world in a way that reflects America's changing circumstances, more limited resources since 9/11. And he's tried to do everything he can to distance himself from the Bush administration's record of preventive doctrine, preventive war, if you like, aggressive unilateralism and regime change. But really the differences have been in degree, not in kind. And so this new intervention that's now more than four months old, his attempt to declare degrading and eventually destroying the Islamic State terrorists, only today has he finally actually called on Congress to give him military authorisation. It's been 4 months in the works. So this is a policy that, although it's not committing to extensive ground troops, it still means that the United States' credibility and prestige is very much involved in Iraq. And it's not altogether clear how this will play out, and it's highly likely that the mission will outlive his presidency.
Bruce, it's interesting because he is someone who has sought to recast the US role in the world. He doesn't want the US to be the world sheriff. He doesn't want the military option to be the first option. But does that also then raise the prospect of a very sort of half-baked approach to tackling a threat as great as Islamic State?
Not necessarily. I agree with Tom as far as the difference of degree, but not of kind. He signaled strongly the drones are going to continue, strikes against terrorists will continue, and he'll just wage war that way. But I think his message to the American people was terrorism is a horrific threat, but I'm managing it, and you should not feel, don't be terrified. Yes, it is a dangerous world. It has several fronts. It is going to come at us, but we know what we're doing. And he's trying to give some comfort.
And the message as well is whether it is Afghanistan, where Afghan security forces are now leading the fight against the Taliban, or whether it is Islamic State, where he's enlisted Arab nations in support as well,
right,
that the fight needs to be taken up by local actors. It's not the US role
it's
entirely.
Not the US, exactly, and it can't be solved just by the US going it alone anymore. So I think he's trying to, again, just have some comfort, to give the American people some comfort. In a very tough world with very hard choices, he's making the right ones.
Tom Switzer, others, though, perceive that as timidity and weakness, and that's been exploited by Vladimir Putin and to some degree at various stages by the Chinese as well, perhaps even the North Koreans. Is he at risk of being seen as being vulnerable or even weak when it comes to foreign policy?
Well, opinion varies. Certainly some neoconservatives and maybe even liberal interventionists in his own party think that he has been too accommodating and weak in the face of threats posed by Vladimir Putin and Islamic State jihadists. But then there is also a significant spectrum of opinion to which I subscribe that thinks that he's actually making a bad situation worse by not understanding why Putin's conducting the kind of foreign policy that he is. That Russia is merely trying to find a bit of strategic space after nearly 2 decades of NATO expansion, for example. And on the question of the Islamic State, you know, he tries to have it both ways. On the one hand, he wants to use the power of American airstrikes to take out the Islamic State terrorists, but he makes it also quite clear he doesn't want to use ground troops, which is really unavoidable if you want to weed out these Sunni jihadists. But I think the fundamental problem here, it's not so much foreign policy, it's trade policy. I was struck that in a speech that went for 6,500 words, Stan, only 1.5 paragraphs on trade promotion authority. Now this is a big issue. The Republicans now have control of both houses of Congress. The Republicans, unlike the Democrats, are pro-free trade. The Republican leadership has made it very clear to the President that they are prepared to give him trade promotion authority so that he can conclude the important Trans-Pacific Partnership, that 12-nation regional free trade agreement that includes Australia by the end of the year. And yet here in the speech, the President only dedicated a paragraph and a half. And he spent a lot of that time focusing on fair trade, not free trade. So I think if you're looking at the president's trade agenda, and remember the TPP is an important part of the president's policy to pivot to East Asia, then I think a lot of Australians, and indeed many people in the region, will be bitterly disappointed.
But Bruce, why is that? I mean, he did say that it's not up to China to set the rules and that China cannot disadvantage the US and disadvantage US workers. And we know that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is designed to address that, and indeed China is not part of that. But why was there, as Tom pointed out, so little focus on that?
Well, I actually thought there was reasonable focus on it, but the fact is it gets to the base of the Democratic Party and the Democratic leadership.
So his problem here is with the Democrats, not with the Republicans.
It's with the Democrats. And the Democratic leadership in both the House and the Senate is violently opposed to Trade Promotion Authority and the trade agreement that is pending. So the question is going to be, the Republicans can pass it in the House. The question is going to be, can they get 60 votes in the Senate? Now, some Republicans do not want to give a president authority, more executive power, particularly after immigration, after Cuba, after climate. And so they're going to lose some Republicans. With all the Democrats against, Republicans have 54 votes. Can they get to 60?
Yeah.
And I think, Tom, it's just because these are really fraught politics, and there's little political reward for dwelling on it, but he still wants to get the job done.
Okay, the big theme here was that the worst of the past decade is over. This was appealing to a sense of optimism in the United States, and the invited guests that he had in the audience spoke to that. There were examples of the optimism that Barack Obama is appealing to. He spoke a lot about middle-class economics, and that will involve a cost in increased taxes and charges on the more wealthy in the society to trickle down some of the benefits of the improving economy. This is what he had to say about the new era that he wants to see in the US.
We are 15 years into this new century. 15 years that dawned with terror touching our shores, that unfolded with a new generation fighting two long and costly wars, that saw a vicious recession spread across our nation and the world. It has been and still is a hard time for many. But tonight, we turn the page.
Well, Tom Switzer, turning the page, is this as much about the 2016 presidential election, trying to frame where that may be, as it is about his own legacy?
Bit of both. I think you have to remember when Barack Obama ran for the presidency against Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primaries in 2008, he distinguished himself by being or wanting to be a transformational president, a bit like Ronald Reagan, in that he would preside over an ideological or a political realignment in Washington. And in many respects, I think his attempts to increase the size and the scope of the federal government, and you see that, it's quite evident in this speech, is in keeping with his aims. So in many respects, it's about his legacy. It's also about shaping the nature of the debate in 2016. But I think broadly speaking, more than any time in his 6 years of his presidency, he's absolutely right to talk about America turning the page. All the available evidence indicates that the Americans are on an upswing trajectory. You know, the consumer confidence hasn't been as high since the subprime crisis in 2007. The deficit is as low as it has been in 7 years. Unemployment has come down from 10% in 2009 to less than 5% today. And of course the economy is going gangbusters, 5% economic growth last quarter. So there's a lot of evidence to indicate that the American economy is on an upswing. The problem though is that inequality has widened in the Obama era and wage growth has been remarkably sluggish. So there are a lot of have-nots still there. A lot of the new jobs that have been created are in low wage and part-time work. Yeah. And that's primarily why the President is talking about using the power of government to help a lot of these middle-class and lower-class folks to try to get a leg up.
Bruce, we're almost out of time, but a final thought from you about where this positions Obama for his legacy, where it positions the presidential election, and the politics of potentially class warfare here as well, and how that may play in the US.
I think he wanted the old Obama to come back tonight, and I think he succeeded in that, in a lot of the oratory, particularly at the end. But I also think he's trying to shape the contours of the 2016 election and what it is a choice between. And I think that he did strengthen the backbone of his fellow Democrats today. But the Republicans, on the other hand, they disliked this speech intensely. The applause was scant, no enthusiasm. They are not going to pass this program, so it's not going to be delivered into law. So you have this divide. But he's trying to have the Democrats lost control of the Congress, be in the strongest position for 2016.
Bruce Waltby, Tom Switzer and David Spears as well from Canberra. Thanks so much for joining us
Steve.
over our special coverage.